We have a candle because it's dark today. If you ever find yourself in the position of perhaps, say, negotiating a prenup with this person, now you have some information that could be helpful. You're welcome. The last few months I've been making videos where I mention, hey, just so you know, farmers aren't poor here in the US. And it's always kind of been a bit of a flyby. Here's the data, moving on. The fact that farmers aren't poor is just something you gotta understand to get to this next thing that we're talking about. But that can still be pretty confusing for people because here in the US, we all grew up hearing about how poor farmers are, how family farms are struggling. Naturally, people have had questions. So today, let's take a little step back from the farm news explainers and current events and just talk about what's going on with farmers and money. We'll call this one, what do you mean farmers aren't poor? Like most things in agriculture, this could go in a million different directions. So let's start with the questions people have. One of the big ones that comes up for people is, but what about these folks I know at the farmer's market? They're not rich. Another major genre of questions that come up is people whose families own farmland saying, but we're not rich. What are you talking about? And there's a lot to dig into with that, so we'll talk about that as well. The glare is crazy. Farmers market hours are designed around when white-collar people have time to go shopping at farmers markets, right? So it's not during business hours. It's going to be early in the mornings or on weekends. Those are also prime customer service job hours. If you're working retail, if you're working restaurants, that tends to be when you're at work. I don't want to paint with a broad brush here, but a lot of the poorer people in the US work retail or other customer service jobs. So your peak work hours happen to be when the farmers market is. You don't have a lot of control over your hours. And if you have to reschedule a lot, then they fire you. There's been a lot of discussion about how farmers markets aren't always accessible for poorer people to go shopping there, but the same things make farmers markets not really accessible to people to sell there. And that's not even getting into, it takes money to make money. We've all heard that saying, right? Starting a business of any kind is not cheap. It's just not. You have to spend money to make money. Well, you have to have money to spend money, right? I know we have kind of a cultural myth of how farming is a folksy poor person job. Farming is not a poor person job. Farming, like running a farm business, is not a poor person friendly thing to do. Working for farmers is very much a thing poor people do. And I think for a lot of US history, we've taken folks who are actually farm workers and we called them small farmers. That's a conversation for a different day. But bottom line, a lot of the folks that we think of in our history as these were struggling small, poor family farmers were not. They were farm workers. They were tenants. They were tenant farmers. They were sharecroppers. They were working on somebody else's land. They were farm workers. And so that might be why we have a kind of a cultural memory of farmers as small, struggling, poor people. We're not actually thinking of farmers there. We're thinking of farm workers. A farmer is more somebody who's running the business. You're a business owner at that point. And just like any business, running a farm, owning the business, means you have to have capital. A farm that's already up and running, you have to spend money at the beginning of the season, then wait several months for the harvest to get paid, right? But a farm that's just starting off, it may take several years for that harvest to actually start paying for itself. You know, like your first year, 2, 3, maybe even 5 or 10, you're still in the hole after you get paid. There's a lot of investment that goes into it. You might have to buy land. You might have to install fencing, irrigation, wells, cooling infrastructure, like a cooler, you know? If you have livestock, you've got to do barns, maybe a milking shed, all of that equipment. That takes years to pay off. Starting a farm is not a per person friendly thing to do. You might see poor and lower income people at your farmer's market because they start a farm. Wait and see how many last 5 years or more. That's often where the wealth difference starts to show up. Because if you have the wealth to ride through several years of losing money, then you're going to be okay. If you don't have the income or the savings to support a few years in a row of losing money, starting a farm is not going to work out very well for you. That's not just a farm thing, that's starting any business. But in agriculture, it's especially so because it can just take a long time for those to start paying for themselves. So this cultural memory that we have of, well, farmers are small, poor, struggling folk, it is not serving us well to understand what's actually happening right in front of us. I don't know if this helps clear it up, but I came up in agriculture as a farm worker. I came up working on other people's farms. And I did not get to the middle class because I started a small farm and earned my way to middle class. I was able to afford to become a small farmer by getting to the middle class doing other things. And so when people talk about small farmers, it's always with a pity, like, oh, those poor things, they're so poor and small and struggling. I can't speak for everybody, but that has not been my experience, and that's not a lot of people's experience. Small farming for a lot of US history, and certainly now, is not about poverty. It's about you finally made it to the middle class so you can afford to go start a homestead. Like, you look at that Conestoga wagon and a couple of cows, that's middle class. There's a reason that the family in Little House on the Prairie is really self-conscious about stigma of being poor, because when you're out with homesteaders, you're with middle class people and they're like, you, what's wrong with you? Long story short, Our cultural memory of farmers or small, poor, struggling little folk is really, it's not accurate in the way that we think it is, and it is certainly not serving us well now to understand what's going on around us now. Today, and I've said this in other videos, most small family farmers are millionaires with a six-figure income. And that's not because their small farm is making tons of money. In fact, their small farm is usually losing money, but they're the kind of people who can afford to have a property that loses money. Right? Some of those people may have inherited that land. It might be a family farm they've had for several generations. And a lot of small farmers out there are doctors, lawyers, dentists. You can only make so much money before your accountant tells you, hey, have you considered buying some farmland? That's a very common route to being a small farmer as well. Buying a small amount of farmland is a really solid financial strategy because of all the laws and policies that the US has that are designed to save small family farms. Well, now if you buy a small parcel of farmland, you get a lot of financial benefits. So lots of people wind up buying small rural properties. After a lot of comfortably middle-class people buy small rural properties, you wind up with lots of small family farms owned by affluent people, even though the small farm is losing money. That's how that happens. Or sometimes they inherit the farm, it's family land, and they go off and they have a day job, and that's what they actually live on, but they still have the family property. Which leads us to the next really common genre of question. It's people who their family owned a farm. Their family were farmers. Their family still owns the farmland, but it's not making a lot of money. Everybody moved away from the farm because it doesn't make enough to support the family, and therefore we can't possibly be rich. What are you saying? The fact that small family farmers are not poor really clashes with their family story, and because that's all really vague, I think it's helpful to just start with a couple of real-life questions, comments that I got from people. This viewer said, "This channel is so helpful." Oh my gosh, thanks. My partner's dad has 250 acres of farmland and some cattle in Illinois. He rents the land to someone else to be farmed. He's also getting a nice paycheck for hosting a windmill. He's definitely doing okay, but he's certainly not rich. So there are still some folks with farms that aren't totally raking in the dollars. So first things first, thank you for trusting me with this story. One of the things people in agriculture like to do and get pretty good at is when somebody talks about here's our property and what we're doing with it, you can do the math in your head pretty quickly to figure out financially where these folks are at. So I'm just going to show you how to do this. Here we go. 250 acres of farmland in Illinois. So you can look up how much farmland in Illinois, what its value is. Illinois farmland is currently going for an average of $13,526 an acre. I think $13,500 an acre for farmland is too high, but my opinions on farmland costs are going to have to wait for a different time. Bottom line for now, 250 acres of land at $13,500 a piece, and that is going to come out to about $3.4 million. Remember when I said most small family farmers are millionaires with a six-figure income? So this guy is checking the millionaire box. Millionaire doesn't mean you're Scrooge McDuck. It just means your net worth is $1 million or over. Now it's possible he has a mortgage on it or something, but I will say the average debt to asset ratio for US farms right now is 0.134, meaning the average US farm's debts is only about 13% of their total value. If he's on track with the average debt to asset ratio for US farms right now, that's still $3 million clear just owning the farmland. But that wealth is all tied up in farmland. I don't know how to break it to folks, but land is a very real financial asset. It's kind of like if you own a house and somebody says, but so much of your wealth is tied up in your house. Yeah, that's how owning a house works for most people. A family farm property is the same thing. Now it does mention also that he's renting that farmland out, which means he's getting rental income. He's a landlord. So let's find out how much money he's making from renting out that farmland. You can look up Illinois farmland rental values. It starts at $200 an acre for meh land and goes up to $500 an acre per year for good land. So that means this guy is making somewhere between $50,000 and $125,000 a year just in rental income. And that's for the farmland. We haven't even gotten into the windmill yet. If he has a day job, even if it's not paying that well, he's probably up to 6 figures in income. So this is how that happens. When we say most small family farmers are millionaires with a 6-figure income, this is exactly the kind of guy that's about. Now it mentions he's making a paycheck from hosting a windmill as well. Windmill lease revenue usually runs from $5,000 to $8,000 a megawatt, and most of your windmills in Illinois are going to be in the 2 to 3 megawatt range. So that's another $10,000 to $24,000 worth of income. So again, we've got a $3 million-ish air guy with $60,000 to $150,000 worth of income that's just passive income, right? He could have a day job on top of that, but he doesn't have to have one. So we've got a situation where someone wrote in and they said, hey, I know you said most small family farmers are millionaires with a 6-figure income, but that's not true. Here's my father-in-law-ish guy who is a 3-millionaire with potentially, quite easily, a 6-figure income. This guy is exactly the kind of person I was talking about. And in case I haven't hammered it home enough yet, this is all passive income. This guy doesn't have to lift a finger to make $60,000 to $150,000 worth of income every year. That's just cashing landlord checks. That's it. I think some of the confusion there might be folks confuse wealth with opulence, right? He doesn't have a private jet, but that doesn't mean you're poor. You know? Wealth means you have enough wealth and income for security, for protection, for being able to make your choices with how you want to spend your time. You don't have to be working all the time. So I think part of why we don't understand that small family farmers are quite wealthy is we don't understand what wealth is. This is part of why I'm so keyed into financial literacy being really important for understanding agriculture. Full on teaching people about financial literacy is not my lane, but this is exactly the kind of scenario where the lack of financial literacy really bites us in the butt. We will point to people who are actually quite wealthy, who could afford to simply retire and be a full-time landlord and say, look, that's one of those poor little guys who's not raking in the money. We don't know what other properties or businesses this guy might own, or if he has maybe a stock portfolio, maybe he had a day job, maybe he's got a good 401k. We're talking minimum $3 million net worth for this guy. $3 million will put you at the 93.5 percentile for Americans in wealth. If you're richer than 93% of the country, if that's not rich, what is? You're certainly not in the 1% or the 0.1%. But you don't need to be that to be wealthy and comfortable. We're not talking about wealth as a measure of how exclusive is this guy? How rarefied is the life he's living? We're talking about wealth in terms of what is the freedom and security that he has. It is pretty significant. Most people have to grind to make a lot less than $50,000 to $125,000 a year. They have to work all the time for it. And this guy can make that without doing anything. But just because he owns property. That's wealth, man. I don't know what to tell you. I feel kind of bad putting this guy on blast like this. We're going to take out his name. We're not going to do any of that. But this is exactly the kind of situation where not understanding how farm wealth works has gotten us a little bit lost on things. I'm not doing this to crush people's dreams. No. This is good information. This person said this is their partner's dad, right? So if you ever find yourself in the position of perhaps, say, negotiating a prenup with this person, now you have some information that could be helpful. You're welcome. Next question. This person says, hey, my family owned farmland, but then we couldn't afford to keep it and had to sell it, and that's why we're poor, actually. Let's unpack this one. I'm descended from many generations of farmers who first settled America in 1750. My grandfather retired from the family farm business by the late 1970s, and he had to sell some land to fund surgeries for himself and cancer treatment for his wife. My father gave the farm a try for a few years, but disease swept through the cattle herd. He and his sisters all later moved away, but shared operating costs with another farmer next door, who would continue to do the hands-on work. We're going to come back to that in a second. My father's generation sold the last bit of acreage by the early 2000s, as their share of profit, after taxes, was only a few $1,000s each, after splitting 3 ways. The family farm that had supported my great-grandfather's family, my father, and got my father and his sisters through college, was no longer viable to sustain a single family with children by the 1980s. This is a very common scenario. You'll have a family farm where the kids move away and the farm is split amongst the kids, but they're not there, nobody's operating it. We delegate running it to some neighbors. It turns out there's not a lot of income there, it's not worth keeping, we sell it. It's a very common pattern. So I want to be kind here because there's a decent number of people in this situation. But while we're being kind, we also want to be clear. That's not just about farming itself becoming less profitable. That's also about some financial decisions this family made and how they're going to handle their assets. This is not just something that happens to you. This is also a consequence of how people choose to manage their assets. So I want to start with, Grandpa had to sell some of this land to fund medical expenses. That is a bummer. That's a thing that happens. A lot of people don't have assets they can liquidate to cover medical expenses. They just stay sick and die. So we'll start with that. I don't know how much to dwell on this. Having an asset that you can sell to pay for things is a lot better than not having the asset to pay for things. So that's a bummer, but there's a reason they sold it and it did what they needed it to do as a financial asset. I want to come back to this part. My dad and his sisters all later moved away, but shared operating costs with another farmer next door who would continue to do the hands-on work. That is called a sharecropping arrangement, and it's not clear on when that happened. It's also not clear what part of the country this was in. You can do contracting arrangements right now that basically are sharecropping, except everybody has contractual protection, so it's a lot better than 1920 sharecropping. That's still a thing that's fairly common in farm country today, is to do those kinds of joint ventures. But that is a sharecropping arrangement. When you have a sharecropping arrangement with a neighboring farm family, you're not a small, poor, struggling family farm. You're landlords. It might not be a large amount of revenue, but this family is getting revenue without having to do anything. Passive income, because they have sharecroppers who are paying them. You know, this is not a small struggling family farm story. And certainly families who own these properties can spin it that way, because grappling with the fact that you have sharecroppers is just a little bit weird. So I just want to draw attention to that, because there are a lot of families who own a lot of farmland who are out here going, wow, I'm making passive income, but it's not as much as I wish it was, therefore we're poor. That's very common, and it's weird once you stop and think about it for a second. What will happen when you own a farm that way and you delegate running it out to sharecroppers? You just wind up growing the cheapest, easiest things to grow. Usually corn and soybeans in most of the country. If it's south of the Mason-Dixon line, you could have cotton, peanuts, tobacco, sweet potatoes, other things thrown in there. The reason for that is, I mean, especially the way he describes it, he's got 3 siblings drawing a piece. So that means you could plant an orchard, right? You could have veggies, but then you'd have to drill wells, invest in irrigation, build a cooler. If you want to switch to dairy or something, or make your own cheese, then you have to build a barn and a cheese making area to do that. That's money, that's investment. So you'd have to get all 3 owners, all 3 siblings to agree on that. And not only are you going to not get that revenue that you're used to getting every year, but you're gonna have to spend money. Good luck getting all 3 owners, all 3 siblings to agree on that and to agree on a specific plan. So anytime you have land that's in this kind of sharecropping or lease or rent out to another farmer agreement, unless you're on the West Coast, because they have a few different things going on there, but on this side of the country, just saying this is just settled before 1750, so that could be somewhere in the Southwest. More likely, it sounds like they're somewhere east of the Appalachians. In that part of the country, you're probably going to be growing corn, soybeans, cotton, peanuts, other fairly low-value crops on that land, just because it's fairly simple to grow year after year. The people you're renting the land to, they have no reason to plant trees. They have no reason to dig wells on your land. Both parties are going to basically do as little as possible to keep the farm going. So you're not investing anything in the land. You have a business where you don't reinvest anything. If you have a store where you never remodel, you don't keep up with the trends of what people actually want to buy, that business will stop making money, and farms are the same way. If you just have a property that you never invest anything in, it's going to make you less and less money. That's how this works. I want to return to this thing where they say, my father's generation sold the last bit of acreage by the early 2000s as their share of the profit after taxes was only a few $1,000s each, split 3 ways. There's a lot to unpack there. Real quick, again, folks who work in agriculture are good at doing mental math on this. A few $1,000s a piece, split 3 ways. So let's be conservative and say $3,000. When people say a few $1,000s, that could be like $10,000 or $20,000. Let's not assume that though. We're just gonna say 3. So $3,000 after you split it 3 ways and after taxes. So 3,000 times 3 becomes $9,000. And that's after taxes. Taxes on farm proceeds can be fairly low. So let's say $10,000 before taxes. And that's the last little bit of farmland is making $10,000 in profit, growing probably corn, soy, cotton, peanuts, that kind of fairly low value crop. If you're clearing $10,000 off of low value crops, and that's just the rental proceeds. The last little scraps that are left over after at least 2 different bouts of selling off land. Sounds like we're talking about a pretty substantial piece of property that was managed in a pretty hands-off manner. That's why I didn't make money. We need to be clear about what's going on here financially, because in the farm community, we tend to do poor mouth. Things aren't going well, I got no money. That's just a habit that we have. Even when things are going well, you will not hear that from farmers. We don't like to jinx it. So we get into this habit of doing poor mouth. We always talk about how poor we are, how things are going badly. When that is how you talk about yourself all the time, sometimes you start to actually believe it and you start to forget what it is that you have. I see a lot of that going on in the farm community. We're so in the habit of talking about how we don't have enough, because what you want to do is always going to be bigger than what you can do. That's going to be true no matter what your wealth or income level. There's no such thing as being so wealthy that you can just do whatever you want. I'm sure even Jeff Bezos thinks, man, I wish I could go to space more often. There's no such thing as having enough money, right? All the money you could possibly want to do everything you could possibly want. That's not a thing that happens to people. So as soon as we hit any kind of financial limitation, it becomes very easy to say, I'm poor. I couldn't do everything I wanted. I couldn't do things perfectly, and that means I'm poor. There's a lot of that going on in the farm community. That's just how we tend to think. And that can lead to a cycle of starting to forget what we have, starting to not realize what its potential really is. So that's why we're having this conversation. The psychology of it all can get really tricky, because as soon as we're talking about land, we are talking about feelings, especially when it comes to family land and family relationships. There's a lot of feelings that get heaped onto that. And that doesn't always help us make the best and clearest decisions that we need to take care of ourselves in our communities. So I think it's really important to to do both of those things, to acknowledge the feelings and talk about the feelings, but also have some clear cut, here's what's actually going on with the material side of our life, the money, the land, the finances. You need to have both. Because if you only talk about the feelings, you can get lost in the sauce. And I think we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that in how agriculture is going right now. In the farm community, there can be a habit of listening to people who tell you what you want to hear, because farming is hard. It is. And that makes you hungry for people who tell you what you want to hear. But when you get into a habit of listening to people who tell you what you want to hear, ignoring people who might bring you bad news or news that's counter to how you want to see things, that is how you get into groupthink. That is how you get into an entire farm sector supporting a guy who promised to wreck your business. That's what happens when you forget to pay attention to the numbers. It is really costly. And we talk about how we love agriculture. Well, I don't think love is lying to people. I don't think love is letting people lie to themselves and not putting a little check on it where you can. If you love agriculture, you want it to survive. And survival means understanding what's really going on beyond the feelings. Actually understanding the brick and mortar and the money and the blood and the dirt that goes into this stuff. Being frank about it, even when it hurts. So yeah, that got kind of deep, but that's why I like to talk about this stuff. That's why I like to talk about how, farmers aren't actually poor. We need to come to face with this and understand what we have and understand what we're working with. There is still a lot of opportunity in agriculture that gets left on the table because going after it is hard. This is not about putting people down. This is about making sure that we understand what's really going on so we can meet reality where it is and do our job as adults to do the best with what we have. Even if it's kind of jarring, straight talk is the best way to get there. It's the best way to do right by people. Anytime you talk about agriculture and wealth, a lot of feelings start to come out. And while we're talking about the facts, because those are really important, we also have to handhold the feelings a little bit because sometimes those get in the way of us facing the facts. It's one thing to get your head on straight, but your heart is there too. And you got to find a way to get your heart working in line with what's going on around you too, or it's not going to work. If you're still watching, thanks for making it to the end. If you like this video, if you feel like you learned something, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe, comment. These things really do help the algorithm know to show this to more people and get the word out. So again, thanks for watching till the end. And if you really like it, there's also a Patreon down below. Hope this was useful for you. Y'all do good out there.